translated her thesis research into a program that continues to provide free medical care to uninsured residents of rural Connecticut. Next up is Jane Beyer, who served as senior health policy advisor to the Washington State Insurance Commissioner since January of 2017. She was legal counsel to Washington State House of Representatives for 20 years, working on a broad range of health and human services issues. Jane served as Washington State's Medicaid Director from 1995 through 1998 and Washington State's Behavioral Health Commissioner from 2012 through 2015. She began her career as a legal services attorney in Tacoma, Washington, graduated with honors from the University of North Carolina School of Law, and is admitted to the Washington State and District of Columbia bars. She's the chair of the National Academy for State Health Policy Executive Committee. And finally, William McGinty joined the Washington Attorney General's Office in 2013 and the Solicitor General's Office in 2025. His practice has included representation of numerous state agencies, including Department of Social and Health Services, Children, Youth, and Families, and the Healthcare Authority. He served as lead counsel in matters in state and federal courts concerning the constitutionality of state statutes and programs, implicating constitutional issues such as the right to armed self-defense, voting rights, equal protection, and separation of powers. He's a graduate of the University of California, Berkeley School of Law, the Evergreen State College, and Deep Springs College. And Evan, go ahead.
Perfect. Good afternoon. So I'm Evan Klein. I'm the Special Assistant for Legislative and Policy Affairs at the Healthcare Authority. I think the recording started right as we were talking about someone with Yale credentials, so you can all attribute that to me if you'd like. Here to talk a bit, here to talk a bit about a number of major recent federal and regulatory and legislative changes that are impacting our state, particularly our state's Medicaid program, which we oversee at the Healthcare Authority. And I think my presentation will be a direct affront to any law professor that suggested Cliff Notes doesn't allow you to succeed in life, because I'm going to try to cover a lot of ground here, so bear with me as I go fast. Want to talk a little about some of the major federal rules first that are creating a context for us at the Healthcare Authority and really around the state as we're looking at how we react to and implement some of the major federal changes that have come more recently this summer with the passage of H.R. 1. So there are quite a few policies that we are in the process of still digesting and implementing as a state that are going to have ranging impacts for our state's Medicaid program. The first of which that I want to just emphasize is there was a federal eligibility and enrollment rule that was really targeting kind of creating equal access to Medicaid coverage across MAGI and classic Medicaid programs around the country. Some of that rule was stayed as part of H.R. 1, but Washington State is in an active mitigation plan with CMS for compliance with updated eligibility and enrollment standards that require us to come into compliance by 2027, creating some parity between our MAGI and classic Medicaid programs. That is work that is underway and requires major systems changes around our state, also staffing impacts. But it's also happening, if you can go back to the last slide, in conjunction with a number of other rules around managed care, access and oversight, and updating prior authorization standards in the Medicaid managed care space as well. So just acknowledging there's a lot that had already been underway, a lot of change that was occurring, some of which was helpful or will be helpful for the clients that we serve, creating easier access to enrollment in the Medicaid program, more automation and electronic tools available, better oversight over managed care, particularly network development and network standards, faster turnaround times with prior authorizations in our Medicaid program. But it is a lot, and it's really the backdrop as we start to think about what's coming in the next couple of years. So next slide. And then next slide after that. So transitioning to this summer, I think we all, had just stepped out of a state legislative session that admittedly was quite difficult given the state budget conditions that exist in Washington, and stepped right into a federal budget that is going to have ranging impacts across our healthcare delivery system. Congress passed the budget in July, right before the July 4th holiday. The budget contains a number of provisions, so not going to speak to everything, and acknowledge that this is going to have ranging impacts, not just for the Medicaid program, but the individual market. Also, Department of Social and Health Services programs like SNAP. So really targeted at low-income individuals around the country. Oh, perfect. And we anticipate, but don't know we don't know the full range of the impacts yet. We know how many people these provisions will affect. We don't know how many people are going to really feel those effects through loss of coverage, but we anticipate it could be in the hundreds of thousands in Washington alone. We're also anticipating that this could result in the loss of funding to the state in the tune of billions over the next 5 to 10 years. Next slide. This is really just an orientation to the major provisions that are impacting the Medicaid program and how they take effect. It's quite a cascade. There are a couple of provisions that are very immediate. We're already starting to feel the effects of here in Washington, particularly related to restrictions on payment for protected health services. And then many more to come in the next couple of years. I'll go into many of these in some degree of detail, but I think it's helpful to see them in order because it really isn't, there's not going to be the immediate impact, but we will see these effects kind of trickle over the next 4 to 5 years, really starting to feel the major effects of the funding reductions in particular as we get into 2028 and beyond. Yeah, yeah. So, so next slide. Thank you. So as I mentioned, just to give you a sense of scale, many of the impacts in the federal budget are directly targeting the kind of the adult MAGI population. Really, we refer to it as the expansion Medicaid population, which in Washington is roughly 620,000 individuals. So work requirements, changes to redeterminations, and the cadence of redeterminations are going to have a heavy impact on that, very specific population, as well as cost sharing obligations. There are other impacts as well, and we don't want to lose sight that there's a lot of targeted direction, I think, right now around lawfully present non-citizens, immigrant populations across different policies coming at the state. And that is true of HR 1's impacts on the Medicaid program as well, with some specific restrictions to access to Medicaid for lawfully present non-citizens. And then, as I mentioned, in total, this is going to have an impact in the billions for Washington. That's both a direct restriction on some of the funding mechanisms that we rely on, and also just the loss of federal funding when people disenroll from coverage. Next slide. So as I mentioned, the first of these provisions that took effect was a prohibition on payment for protected health services with federal funds. This is really a targeted prohibition on federal funding in the Medicaid program going to Planned Parenthood. We in Washington are lucky enough that our state leadership, both the governor's office and state legislative officials, have come to the table and participate in conversations to ensure that we can continue as an agency to pay claims from Planned Parenthood in the Medicaid program. And so we have not seen an impact on access, which is a great story that we can tell, but it will have an impact of roughly $11 million in federal funding that we're losing, where we're supplementing with state dollars over the next year. It's a provision that took effect immediately upon enactment of HR 1 and runs for a 1-year duration. It was originally enjoined. There was a lawsuit filed in early July by Planned Parenthood Federation of America. It received a preliminary injunction in district court, I believe, in Massachusetts. And that injunction had been in place through early September. The First Circuit overturned that on September 11th, or stayed the injunction. There's a separate case that's also funneling through the courts right now that Washington State is party to, I believe, with 20 other state attorney general's offices, seeking to stay the provision on different grounds. So the Planned Parenthood Federation had sued on First Amendment grounds. There's a separate suit from states on spending clause grounds. And so we are seeing that continue to move through the courts as well. So more to come, I think, as to whether this remains in effect for the entire one-year duration. But right now, where we are is we are covering these services in Washington. Next slide. In addition, there are some major eligibility changes that I'll talk to. The first of which is a provision related to federal funding for lawfully present non-citizens, particularly refugees and asylees. That takes effect October 1st of 2026 in Washington. That's roughly 30,000 individuals that we currently cover in the Apple Health program. These individuals may have access to other programs as they lose coverage, and we're going to be doing whatever we can as a state agency to try and keep people enrolled in coverage. But there are limitations, and we know that coverage options that may exist on the exchange pose affordability barriers for people who are at the lowest income thresholds, and some of our other coverage options in the state are either capped because of funding or are limited benefit like emergency medical services. Next slide. I project to the room. I apologize for this online. I'll eat it. Yes, thank you. That is what I'm hearing. So and this is probably the provision of the federal budget that has garnered the most attention. It's work requirements. I think it's framed as community engagement requirements, but the idea is trying to require that Medicaid enrollees are working or engaging in some other community engagement activity at least 80 hours per month. This provision takes effect December 31st of 2026. There is a provision in the federal budget that allows states to seek a waiver for 2 years to push implementation to December of 2028. It's discretionary. So I think where we are right now is we have no guarantee that we would have extended time to implement this provision, and are working with the understanding that we have to try to come into compliance as a state within the next year and a half. It's a provision that applies to individuals aged 19 to 65. So this is that adult expansion population that's around 620,000 in Washington. Next slide. We don't know what the full effect of this will be. We are reliant on experience from only 2 states that have tiptoed into implementation. Georgia is the only active state that's working through work requirement implementation. What we know from those states is these provisions are very expensive. The implementation costs alone tend to outweigh any savings that are perceived or associated with losses of coverage. And they're really burdensome for clients. And so I think the thing that we're trying to work through as a state is how can we mitigate the impact on people that do that through automation of systems, hiring the appropriate staff so that we can work with them to manage a already cumbersome enrollment process. Navigating healthcare is complex. This is going to make it more complex. But we know that the procedural barriers are going to lead to losses of coverage. So there are a lot of projections out there. I don't want to speculate as to how many people we think will lose coverage, especially because everything we're going to be doing is to try and mitigate those impacts. But we think the effect will be pretty ranging. Next slide. There are a number of exemptions in HR 1 related to work requirements. I've listed them here, won't go into them in detail. The top line for us right now is we don't know what some of these provisions mean. We're still awaiting federal guidance. CMS is intending to put out rules. They've set a deadline for themselves by roughly middle of 2026 as we approach a state legislative session where we're going to have to seek funding to implement these provisions. We expect to be engaging quite a bit in the dark. We're hoping that we'll get some additional guidance here in the next couple of months, but still awaiting, clarity on what some of these provisions mean, what type of documentation requirements might be necessary, et cetera. Next slide. That's not the only eligibility provision. There are other major provisions in the budget. I'm going to breeze through them a bit here. The first is 6-month redeterminations. Right now, as a state, we redetermine eligibility for individuals in the Medicaid program once a year. We do that to try and minimize the burden on individuals to come back in and update their information. And to be frank, most people have their eligibility automatically renewed. We know that the income that they've provided to us matches information that we have in state systems, and therefore we're able to automatically renew them and move through those applications really quickly. But roughly 15% of the population that we serve requires additional touch, and it's those individuals that we're most worried about as we think about an increased frequency of redeterminations. Next slide. As we start to get into the out years of the provisions in HR 1, there are broader impacts that start to touch more directly on cost. As you see in 2026, 2027, a lot of eligibility related provisions are taking effect. And then starting in October 1st of 2028, imposition of cost sharing requirements in Medicaid. Medicaid right now in our Apple Health program in Washington, we're fortunate that there are no premium requirements for individuals under 138% of the federal poverty level and no cost sharing obligations. And we know that any dollar paid for healthcare services can create a barrier for someone who might be earning as little as $16,000 per year. Awaiting a lot of additional guidance. We expect rules on this provision over the next year to give us a better understanding of what they mean, because it's not clear. Could we charge a penny? Do we need to charge more than that? What does that mean? How do we collect funding? But just recognizing that this is a provision that takes effect in 28. Next slide. Another major provision that impacts cost or will is related to state-directed payments. There's also some caps around provider taxes. These are really, as a top-line, mechanisms that we leverage and other states leverage in Medicaid programs to increase reimbursement for providers, which thereby creates access in Medicaid, or at least attempts to. State-directed payments are a major provision that have been leveraged in Washington State, particularly to increase the reimbursement for hospital services in our Medicaid program. The top line here is by prohibiting state-directed payments from exceeding Medicare levels, and that ramp down starting in 2028, we'll lose roughly $1.5 billion in funding that's going out to our state's hospitals, and that's per year. So it's going to take some time to feel the full effect of that provision. It starts in we're capped at our current levels today, and then there's a ramp down that starts in 2028 by 10% per year. But once feeling the full effect of that, a pretty extensive reduction of funding going into our delivery system. Next slide. So rural health funding, this also I know has received quite a bit of press recently. We as a state are working through an application to apply for funds that can be used to support our rural health delivery system. There's $50 billion that were included in the budget. It's $10 billion per year across 5 years that states have to apply for. It's a one-time application. If a state receives funds, they're guaranteed to get a proportional amount of 50% of the funds across all states that are approved for an application. The other 50% of the funds are really discretionary based on a scoring rubric that was released by CMS. So just noting, we are working on an application. The deadline is November 5th. We've been soliciting stakeholder feedback from around the state and have received over 160 comment letters to date. There's a lot of work going on to get an application across the finish line. It's really one of the few opportunities in HR 1 to help invest back in the delivery system. And it's not going to be a backfill, right? We know that the amount of money coming back, while the numbers might seem large, they kind of pale in comparison to the reductions in funding in our delivery system that are going to come. Next slide. Yeah. So there are a number of other Medicaid provisions. I'm not going to spend time on those. And I have some additional content in my presentation that some ground that I was asked to cover related to data privacy, because there's a lot that's happening in the sub-regulatory space as well, and engagement with the agency and engagement across federal agencies. And there's also some work that we've been doing at the Healthcare Authority and around the state around access and affordability. So we'll just highlight that there was a piece of legislation that passed this year, Senate Bill 5083, that seeks to implement reference pricing in our public and school employee benefits program, with the goal of driving better affordability for our state employees and teachers around the state. And I think the top line there is, even with everything that's going on with our delivery system, affordability isn't going to, those challenges aren't going to go away. And so, we as a state are continuing to think about everyone that's impacted by access challenges and by the cost of our current healthcare system. So that was a lot. I'm going to pass it to Joan, who's also going to talk a lot about other things that are impacting.
How close is just right with this? It's the same question we're asking about the audience in front of us. It's like an interactive session for those who are online. Our audience is up here with us. We're in community. We're mending together. Thanks to Anatai and the building and the view behind us that will keep everyone entertained while I am speaking. Joan Altman, I work at the Washington Health Benefit Exchange. What was left out of my bio was that my first was at the Attorney General's office, but the second internship I had in law school 100 years ago was as a NOLA legal intern. So you too can be here if you dedicate time to working for free for NOLA. Hafak and I think is who was here when I was there. So anyway, good to be back supporting NOLA. Glad to see everybody here. The Washington Health Benefit Exchange, for people who are less familiar, we're kind of the newer state agency entity on the block, especially sitting between Healthcare Authority and OIC. We are a creation of the Affordable Care Act. So the Affordable Care Act lets states create a marketplace and or use a federal marketplace to enroll people in private health insurance coverage and to link people to available federal and state subsidies. So back when we first launched we stood up in 2011, 2012, launched 2013, 14, we were one of a handful of state-based marketplaces. Since then, the tide has really turned toward more states investing the resources to stand up a state-based marketplace because you're not tethered to the federal marketplace in the same way. So it's sort of a theme of the remarks here will be Washington State has enacted some protections that make us a better state to be in right now due to the foresight of legislature and others. We do have additional mechanisms that we use in Washington State to let people, regardless of their immigration status, get coverage through Washington Health Plan Finder. That is true today. That will be true tomorrow. So nothing that you'll hear today is changing that. You'll hear a lot that's changing affordability. You'll hear a lot that's going to challenge access. But at the end of the day, the clients you're working with will have a place that they can go and seek coverage, particularly if they're able to afford it, even if it's just for a limited amount of time. You do have that option in Washington State. I will also say that as you all are disseminating information about the federal changes, we have been hearing, this is my PSA and request, there's a lot of circulation of material that it may be true at the federal level or may be true for other state-based marketplaces that are not true in Washington. And so, here to offer resources, and also to the extent that there's ever a question about whether something you're hearing at the federal level applies here, welcome that feedback and outreach and those questions. I'll be talking a lot about the deferred action childhood arrivals population. That's one where there's been a lot of federal discussion about everybody who's a DACA recipient losing healthcare coverage, and that just isn't true here. And so we just really want to make sure, to the extent that we're messaging to community, that we're aligned in some areas where we may have some more flexibility than at the federal level. Those are my requests. Let's sort of get into what these federal changes are. So you'll hear Will talk about some of these, and there are basically three big things that have happened that are culminating now to restrict access or challenge affordability for people. The first is this marketplace integrity rule that was finalized over the summer. The second is HR 1, which is what I will call the big, beautiful thing, the big, beautiful bill that passed. And then we also, sitting in the background of all this, have the expiration of enhanced premium tax credits, which is a large federal subsidy that was created under the Affordable Care Act that is reducing people's premiums you know, with where we are now, it can be reducing people's premiums anywhere from $300, $400, $500 a month. It is a significant savings to our customers, and that is slated to expire at the end of this year. You will hear our congressional delegation has been very active up on the Hill and at the federal level trying to get these enhanced premium tax credits extended. It's still very much a topic of debate right now as we're heading toward potential shutdown. What a key negotiation point in those discussions is whether or not these can be extended, even if just for a year, to help as we're experiencing all these other changes. Next slide, please. I cleverly put my probably most informative from a legal perspective slides at the very end of the appendix. So to the extent that you are perusing this later, the appendix will tell you sort of what the federal changes are that will have an impact in Washington in 26 and 27. Whoa. And then what? Okay. And then what the changes are that will have will have no effect or not an immediate effect in Washington because of some of the protections I was mentioning. So that's probably worth referencing, but I'm just going to run through the marketplace rule. You'll see in the slides as we're talking about them, or you're referencing them later, everything reduces enrollment and increases premiums to a different extent. So that's sort of the takeaway here. But under the marketplace rule, not only are they looking at affordability changes and benefit changes, they're also looking at shortening the open enrollment period. They're looking at adding new administrative requirements. They're looking at narrowing eligibility. So it is a pretty comprehensive kind of death by a thousand cuts type of approach in the marketplace rule. The next slide talks about HR1. And again, I'll focus mostly on the sort of more vulnerable population-specific impacts here. But in addition to kind of going after lawfully present non-citizens, as Evan mentioned, there's a lot of attention on fraud, waste, and abuse, particularly as it relates to these federal subsidies. Is everyone getting a federal subsidy, the person who should be getting them? What if you got it for a period of time? You know, what if you have to pay it back? So a lot of focus on the federal subsidies, and then eligibility, and then also a lot of administrative with no additional dollars to the states. A lot of changes about how you need to verify people that are going to create some administrative burden too. The next slide shows you just in a, we can jump ahead one more, but again, the loss of the enhanced federal tax credits at the federal level would be about a $300 million impact to the state of Washington. So it's something we're watching, and we don't have an immediate way to mitigate that loss at the state level, but we do have a state subsidy program that we're looking to continue and maybe increase to help, but we don't have an ability to backfill $300 million that we know of, but we are sitting in this building. I'm just kidding. Okay, so here's the timeline of key marketplace changes. Again, deferred action childhood arrivals and the loss of federal subsidies for DACA recipients is happening now. So we'll cover that. And then over the next 2 years, you have coming right up for 2026, we're about to send a letter to 10,000 people telling them that they are no longer eligible for tax credits in 2026. And then we'll be doing that again for close to 15,000 people for next year. So it's tough times communicating these changes and why they're happening, and talking to people about how they're going to continue to get healthcare is very top of mind. The next slide shows you the kind of three main population-specific, slide 8, 9, for those following at home, shows you the three populations that are a focus right now. This is within my coverage expansion portfolio with the exchange. The DACA customers, deferred action child arrival recipients, they are losing, several hundred people are losing their federal subsidies as of October 1st. We've sent that letter out. We've engaged with those populations. They will maintain their qualified health plan and qualified dental plan coverage through the exchange. They will see their premium go up. Some of them will have a state subsidy to offset the premium, but no one will lose coverage to the extent that they are able to keep paying their premiums. We can go to the next slide. The next two, and then the next, we'll talk about the next populations further in a minute. But yeah, so DACA implementation has happened and is right in front of us. This lawfully present customers under 100% of the federal poverty level, that's the 10,000 people that we're about to send a letter to. These are people who would otherwise, there's a provision in the Affordable Care Act that says if you're incredibly low income and you're getting denied Medicaid because of your immigration status, you can get federal subsidies in the exchange. That has been eliminated. So again, people who are under 100% of FPL as our lowest income customers who can't get onto Medicaid can no longer get federal subsidies on the exchange. We do have a state subsidy that will be available in 2026 to help mitigate that a little, but the percent of, if someone's under 100% of the federal poverty level and their net premium after state subsidies is $300 a month, we can do math and understand what percent of that household income you'd be paying. The next population are the same customers, lawful permanent, unless you are moving forward and for purposes of healthcare, accessing healthcare under the Affordable Care Act. If you are lawfully present and you are a lawful permanent resident or a green card holder, you're a Cuban or Haitian entrant, or you're a COFA migrant, you are okay. And you can continue accessing federal subsidies. You can continue accessing Medicare. You can continue accessing Medicaid. Those are sort of the three permissible lawfully present categories that are continuing as we move forward in the Affordable Care Act. If you are not in any of those groups, you are lawfully present but not in one of those groups, that is who over the next 2 years where there's a lot of impact in their lives. So again, you can continue to access coverage to the extent you can afford it, but you are losing all access to federal subsidies, Medicaid and Medicare, essentially. The next slide shows you just, again, Evan spoke to the Medicaid changes, did want to note the Medicare changes. So already right now, this went into effect over the 4th of July. If you are not in that same category of non-citizens I just mentioned, you can no longer get on Medicare. And if you do have Medicare, you're going to get kicked off starting in 2027. So impacts and considerations for us, just winding down and welcome people's questions at the end or when we do that, Vanessa, if we leave you anytime. Obviously the new and significant affordability challenges, this is low-income seniors, this is non-citizens. These are already people who are facing access barriers and turning between programs who are going to face steeper road there. Communication challenges, language access, the timing, the differences in the effective dates as you talk about Medicare, Medicaid, private coverage, what's still covered and what isn't, and when you have to do what by when. The potential tax liability risks. So, all these changes to your immigration status-based eligibility could lead to ineligible members receiving federal subsidies. And is there going to be a payback risk? Is that going to get clawed back? Could it be taken to its extreme? Could this be something that's used to show that you are, you've sort of violated deportation risk or violated your public burden test? And then there's also immigration enforcement considerations here. To the extent that data sharing has become more fluid at the federal level, which is we haven't seen in the past, there are implications for people in privacy considerations when they apply for healthcare coverage. We are taking some steps, and this is my positive. I'm attempting to leave you with a silver lining or a positive note, which is, at the federal level, the subsidies might continue. Also at the state level, we do have the federal waiver. We're the only state in the country that has a waiver that says, regardless of who you are, you can apply for coverage through the exchange. And even if that waiver were to be withdrawn at the federal level, we have some mechanisms in place to continue that coverage. So we feel good about a continued doorway and pathway, and then the focus really shifts to affordability. And then at the state level, we've used some policy levers to try to maximize the federal subsidy amount. We've dedicated some new funding to work with community-based organizations. We're working on a multicultural campaign to address these changes specifically. We're trying to leverage our sponsorship program, which is a way that we leverage private funding and non-state funding to help pay for premiums. So we have a program in Washington State where, if someone has $1 million that they wanted to give us, or, give the people of Washington State, we could connect that $1 million with, low-income people in Pierce County and help, or DACA residents, or, whatever population folks would want to focus on and help cover their premiums, bring their premiums down to zero. We're also doing what we can in a marketplace curation perspective, which is a nice handoff to Jane, around how can we sort of leverage the levers we have and the plans we offer through the exchange to try to make them as affordable as possible in an environment where you don't want to be selling someone skinny coverage. You want the coverage to be meaningful, but you want someone to be able to afford coverage if they're in a position where they need it. And then again, trying to work with our colleagues at Medicaid to make sure we can do the handoffs we need to as people are exiting Medicare or exiting Medicaid. I think that's it. The end. I didn't even get yanked. Oh, there's one more slide that just will show you the customer communications we have planned, your clients and people that you work with or community groups that you engage with. We've already sort of communicated the changes that are coming for October 1st. We're released our public rates showing that premiums are going up, and that's on top of whatever additional affordability challenges might be coming. We're about to mail out the notice informing people of their loss of APTC for the coming plan year, and then our open enrollment where people can come in and continue to get coverage if they're able to afford it, starts November 1st. So November 1st to January 15th, folks can come in and purchase coverage if they need it. The end.
Thanks, Joan. Okay, you guys know I've been doing this for a long time. And many of us in this room have probably been through times that are almost as bad as right now. I'm thinking about the 2009-2011 recession and all the challenges that created. So it is pretty dark hearing about all of these things. I think about families where you've got a spouse who's 66, who's getting coverage through Medicare, a spouse who's 63, who's getting coverage on the exchange, and thinking about how incredibly confusing it's going to be, especially and folks in families that have mixed immigration status. So, and then I also will say that Joan didn't talk in detail about Cascade Care Subsidies, which is our state-funded subsidy program, which the legislature has only funded through Plan Year 26. And then Evan's discussions about risks to programs and individuals who are immigrants, both across Medicaid and the Health Benefit Exchange. I don't know if this mic is working, but okay. So one of the things that we think about is when you think about all the different cuts that are coming down from the feds, I can tell you I've had multiple discussions with people who say, we're going to ask the legislature to backfill that cut. And some of you might have heard the revenue forecast yesterday. It's not very good. And so what that means is, if you want to look at it from the perspective of an opportunity, it's an opportunity to think creatively, which is what we're all going to have to be doing for the next several years. So I'm going to give you an example of that. Back during the 2009-2011 recession and before that recession, Washington State had a program where the state fully funded vaccines for all kids. It was called the Universal Vaccine Program. And it was, I can't remember whether it was $50 million a year or $50 million a biennium. But the legislature said, we can't afford this, and directed legislative staff, the docs, a variety of different physicians groups, the health insurers, everybody to go behind closed doors for a 6-month period and figure it out. And we did figure it out. And what emerged is what's called the Washington Vaccine Association, and we shamelessly stole it from New Hampshire. I am always open to shamelessly stealing other states' good ideas. But essentially, it's a mechanism so that we could sustain that program and keep buying vaccines at the lower price that you could get them from the feds. So big challenge, people putting their heads together and acknowledging we don't want to make a pediatrician go out and have to buy different vaccines for herself and then figure out how she has to bill whichever health insurance plan the kid is on. So this is an opportunity for creativity. And it's also, I think, an opportunity to get people around the table and force discussions that in good financial times, people don't talk to each other because they're sort of like, I'm after the money that's out there. And so that's just sort of my intro to thinking about what I'm going to talk about. Just as a sort of baseline, the Office of the Insurance Commissioner regulates what are called fully insured health plans. About 1.2 million people in the state get their coverage from these plans. These are plans where either an individual, i.e. the folks that get coverage through the marketplace, or generally, or an employer says, I'm not taking on any financial risk for my employees' health insurance coverage. Like health insurer, you take care of it. But probably about 2.5 million people, I think, Denise, about 2.5 million people in the state get their health care coverage through self-funded health plans, which under federal law, states cannot regulate. So all the large employers that are out there, not all, but most self-fund their health plans. So when the legislature passes a law that says health insurance has to, the has to is the 1.2 million people that are in fully insured health plans. And it causes a lot of confusion and I think a lot of consumer consternation when, for example, the legislature passes a mandate to cover hearing aids. And then somebody from a big company says, well, wait a minute, my plan doesn't cover hearing aids. And then we have to explain what the distinction is. But our office is responsible for reviewing all of the health plan rates that are submitted for the individual health plans, i.e. the exchange, and then small employer health plans. And we have to improve what the insurers give us if their rates are actuarially sound, which is a really fancy way of saying they can justify based upon all of the claims that they're paying and all their other expenses that they're charging a fair premium. And you might have heard that for the individual market, we announced earlier this month that the rates were going up on average 20%. And while we can pin some of that on what's happening at the federal level, we cannot pin most of that on what's happening at the federal level. So what drove those rate increases? People are using more services, and the services that people are using are more expensive, which is everywhere in the healthcare system. It doesn't matter what program you're covered by. And it's aggravated by hospital and health system consolidation that's going on not just in Washington state, but all around the country. In addition, there was a piece of that rate increase that's attributable to the fact that those enhanced premium tax credits are expiring at the end of the year. If I'm a health insurer, the way I'm thinking about it is if premiums are getting a hell of a lot more expensive, the first people that are going to say, I ain't doing this are young people and healthy people. And what that means is that the people who are left that they're covering are older and sicker. And I lived through, I don't know if anybody else did, the 1999, Pam did, the 1999 death spiral in the individual market in Washington state. The market literally collapsed. And it was because of premiums went up, people who got covered got sicker, premiums went up again, people who got covered got even sicker. And we have Affordable Care Act protections now, which are great, but it's still unsustainable to have a market like that. Next slide. So let's think a little bit and talk a little bit about one of the biggest mitigation strategies, because I think for Evan, I think for Joan, for OIC, we are all about how can we mitigate the risk? How can we lessen the risk that's out there? So some of you probably know that under the Affordable Care Act, people of income below 250% of poverty can enroll in a plan that has lower deductibles and lower cost sharing. And back in 2017, during the first Trump administration, the Fed said, we're no longer funding those. And so the Health Benefit Exchange and the Office of the Insurance Commissioner in states all around the country got creative and said to the health insurers, okay, you can recover what the feds aren't giving you anymore by charging more for silver health plans on the health benefit exchange. And that's called silver loading. And that's been in place since 2018 to today. Next slide, please. But what happened is now comes the expiration of the enhanced premium tax credits. And so we in the Health Benefit Exchange are saying, how can we mitigate the damage? And Washington and about 4 other states have adopted what we're calling a premium alignment rule, or a silver loading rule, that essentially is designed to maximize the amount of federal premium tax dollars that we can bring in to try to soften the impact of the increased rates that folks are going to have to pay on the exchange. And what that means is, if you can see the slide, it means that the biggest rate increases are for those silver health plans, because we've sort of loaded premium in so that folks can get more help. And Joan can explain the complicated formula. But the bottom line is, it was a mitigation strategy, and we're hoping that more people hold their coverage because of that. Every year, the feds put out a rule that governs what it's going to be like on the exchange for the upcoming year. We're waiting for the notice of proposed rulemaking on that one. It should probably come out sometime in the next couple of months, and we'll see whether silver loading is restricted or not. We think it might be. So next slide. So let's talk about gender affirming care. The final marketplace rule includes a provision that prohibits the inclusion of what are called sex trait modification procedures, brand new term, in our state's essential health benefits benchmark plan beginning next year. The essential health benefits benchmark plan is essentially the minimum coverage that has to be available for individual and small employer plans. And essentially, and we have in our currently approved benchmark plan in Washington State, gender affirming care. So this rule would change that. And Will's going to talk probably about the challenge to that rule, and we're still waiting for a decision from the federal court. But the most important thing to remember from a consumer's perspective is that that care is still going to be covered, because we have a state law that mandates coverage of those services. So from a consumer's perspective, I can still get coverage. However, next slide, because these services are not an essential health benefit, they're not subject to the protections around annual and lifetime limits on benefits or maximum out-of-pocket protections. If somebody's going through a gender affirming care procedure, that's a pretty hefty cost, and having that not apply toward your deductible and your MOOP is a problem. And so, as I indicated, because we still have a mandate under state law that says these services have to be covered, and we have until hopefully a court orders otherwise, a prohibition on that service being covered as an essential health benefit, it raises the question of the state potentially needing to pay the cost of that benefit. And so that's the rubrics cube that we are working on right now. And then finally, preventive services. You've probably heard about what's happening with ACIP and what people are concerned. ACIP is the Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices, the federal advisory committee. And you've heard about changes in immunization practices. And then some of you, the Braidwood decision, folks know the Braidwood decision. So people thought the Braidwood decision was really good, and it was in a way, because it said the preventive services provision is constitutional. But what's notable about the Braidwood decision is that the court said that the Secretary of HHS can fire, can add at will any membership to the U.S. Preventive Health Services Task Force can reject a recommendation of the U.S. Preventive Health Services Task Force and can say, nice recommendation, I'm not going to require that it be covered. So Braidwood was good, but Braidwood had some drawbacks. And on preventive services, all of the federal preventive services requirements are tied to ACIP, U.S. Preventive Health Services Task Force. Our state law that requires coverage of preventive services is also tied to those provisions. So how are we responding to this? Next slide. We have basically said to all the health insurers when they filed their health plans, their individual and small employer health plans in May of 2025, we said, okay, you're obligating yourself to the immunization schedule and to the preventive services schedule that was in effect on May of 2025. And that's good through the end of 2026. And then we saw the Department of Health step up with the West Coast Alliance, with the standing order to try to ensure that there's access to coverage. And so next step on that one is we're working with the Department of Health to bring legislation to the 26th legislature to basically decouple our law from what the feds are doing. And so we'll be working on that. And then just super quickly on health, don't lose sight of healthcare affordability. Like I said, in terms of the rates, we're super worried about everything that's going on, but we need to be super equally worried about fundamental affordability issues. And I will hand it to Will.
Thanks so much, Jane. That was great. Really fascinating. Thank you so much for having me here. I'm going to talk about 4 cases today that have to do with Washington's challenge to certain federal actions implicating the healthcare space. I need to give you a disclaimer first. So none of the opinions that I give you today are legal advice. They're also not official opinions of the Attorney General or the Attorney General's office. I also want to give you a plug to our website, www.atg.wa.gov. We recently instituted a federal litigation tracker, which will have all of the cases that we have instituted against the federal government since January 20th, 2025, some of which that I'm not going to be talking about today involve healthcare. And since we only have a limited time, I'm really only going to cover highlights here. There's links to all of the court documents, the complaints, that kind of thing that you can get through the website. So skip ahead 2 slides, please, to the cases I'll talk about today. There's 4 of them talking about Washington v. Trump, which is a case having to do with gender-affirming care. There's California v. Department of Health and Human Services, which has to do with Medicaid data security. There's New York v. Department of Justice, which has to do with PROWARA. And then there is California v. Kennedy, which Jane just alluded to, that has to do with the marketplace integrity rule. So starting first on Washington v. Trump. So this started on January 20th, 2025, when President Trump issued Executive Order 14168, which was titled Defending Women from Gender Ideology Extremism and Restoring Biological Truth to the Federal Government. That's the name of the executive order. I wouldn't say those words in that order otherwise. And it has a policy in section 2. You go ahead and, yeah, exactly, perfect. It has a policy, and it says it's the policy of the United States to recognize 2 sexes, male and female. These sexes are not changeable and are grounded in fundamental and incontrovertible realities. This is the policy of the executive order that's being set out. It's the policy of the United States basically to erase trans existence. That's basically what this is saying. Next slide, please. It has some definitions, including gender ideology, which replaces the biological category of sex with an ever-shifting concept. It permits the false claim that males can identify and thus become women and vice versa. It also includes the idea there's a vast spectrum of genders. It diminishes sex as an identifiable or useful category. So putting these 2 things together, it's the policy of the United States that gender ideology, which includes the idea of gender identity, is false. That's what this executive order is saying. Next slide, please. Then it has some instructions to all federal agencies. This is section 3E and G of Executive Order 14168. It says agencies shall take all necessary steps as permitted by law to end the federal funding of gender ideology. And it also says federal funds shall not be used to promote gender ideology. Each agency shall assess grant conditions and grantee preferences and ensure that grant funds do not promote gender ideology. So grant funds, federal funding, cannot be used if it is in any way, shape, or form acknowledges that someone's gender identity might be different from the sex that they were assigned at birth. That's what this executive order is saying. Then next slide, please. The next executive order was issued on January 28th, 2025, and this was called Protecting Children from Chemical and Surgical Mutilation. In our papers, we called this the Denial of Care Order because it was focused on preventing the funding of gender-affirming care. This also had a policy section, same basic thing. It's the policy of the United States under this executive order to not allow gender-affirming care for children. But there's some tricky definitions to this particular executive order. Next slide, please. In section 2, define child as someone who's under 19. So that's not the normal definition of child in most states of the United States. Usually people who are 18 and over are adults. But here, if you're 18 years old, you're a child. It also defines pediatric in the same medical care of a child. So it's pediatric care if you're 18 years old and receiving care. And then it defines chemical and surgical mutilation as basically 3 things: the use of puberty blockers in a person who does not identify as the sex that they were assigned at birth, which is interesting because it's saying only puberty blockers for trans people are as chemical and surgical mutilation for any reason. You can get a puberty blocker for all kinds of reasons. You might want to have a puberty blocker. Your doctor might prescribe it for you. But if you're a trans person, then that's chemical and surgical mutilation. Then it also defines chemical and surgical mutilation as the use of sex hormones to align an individual's physical appearance with an identity that differs from their sex defined in the gender ideology order that we talked about just a minute ago. And it also includes surgical procedures, which also constitute gender-affirming care. So then this order also directed agencies to do some things. Next slide, please. Section 4 of 14187 said that you can't use federal research or education grants for the purposes of chemical and surgical mutilation of children. So putting these 2 things together, these 2 orders together, what they do is they threaten all federal funding for institutions that provide gender-affirming care. Because of course you can't provide gender-affirming care without acknowledging gender identity. And then of course in section 4 of 14187, it just specifically prohibits federal funding for being used for that purpose. So we sued about it. Next slide, please. We sued over it. This is the caption of the complaint. There's 7 plaintiffs, 4 states, Washington, Minnesota, Oregon, and Colorado, and then 3 physician plaintiffs who were granted leave by the court to use pseudonyms. And we basically claimed that this was a violation of the Constitution because it was preventing institutions in our states, including UW-Medicine, from providing gender-affirming care without threatening all of their federal research and education funding, which in these, I'm sure this room knows, is a massive gun to the head of these kinds of institutions. So we sued about it. Next slide, please. And we have this is the timeline, the basic status of the case, but the basic status of the case is we got a preliminary injunction that was issued on February 28th, 2025. That's been appealed to the Ninth Circuit. The United States has also moved to stay the preliminary injunction at district court, and the stay and the appeal have yet to be ruled on. So that PI is in place. There's also another case out of the District of Maryland brought by PFLAG, and it's PFLAG v. Trump, and there's a preliminary injunction in that case as well. So I do want to talk a little bit about what the judge held in our case, because I think it's important. So next slide. This is the order that grants in part and denies in part the motion for preliminary injunction. part of our motion was denied, and we can talk about that if there's questions. But the sections that I went over before, sections 3E and G of gender ideology and section 4 of denial of care, both of those were all enjoined. There was another section of denial of care that was not enjoined by the preliminary injunction. We can talk about that if there's questions. But the first thing the judge said, and next slide, please, was that the president cannot constitutionally condition funding in a way that Congress hasn't allowed, right? Because the president does not have the unilateral authority to refuse to spend the funds that Congress appropriates. The president cannot switch the Constitution on or off at will to advance his policy preferences. That's unconstitutional. Next slide, please. Then the other thing that the court held was that both of these orders violated the Equal Protection Clause of the Fifth Amendment of the United States Constitution. And there was two different reasons for that. The court held that what the court called the medical services order, what we called a denial of care, did not survive what's called heightened scrutiny, right? In the Ninth Circuit, if you discriminate on the basis of sex or on trans identity by denying gender-affirming care, then that's subject to heightened scrutiny. The government needs to show that there's a good reason for doing what it is doing. But the court here held that the order rejects the prevailing medical consensus without engaging in the basis for that consensus or weighing the relevant risks against countervailing benefits established in the record. In this case, we had a huge team in the Washington State Attorney General's office who did this. We had dozens of lawyers, and we submitted hundreds of declarations from the community, from doctors, from trans adolescents, from parents, all talking about how important this care was to their families and to themselves. And the court held, well, you don't have a good reason. You have mountains of evidence on one side and no evidence on the other, so that cannot survive heightened scrutiny. Next slide, please. So it violated the Equal Protection Clause of the Fifth Amendment. The next slide. The other order, the gender ideology order, failed the equal protection test for a more fundamental reason. It reflected a bare desire to harm an unpopular group. The government can't take actions just to hurt people. That's against the Constitution. That's unconstitutional. But the court here held that that's exactly what the gender ideology order did. It denied and denigrated the very existence of transgender people, and it aims to erase them, what the court in Seattle held. So the gender ideology order also violated the Equal Protection Clause of the Fifth Amendment. Next slide. So that's that case. So moving on to the next one, California v. Department of Health and Human Services. This was something we learned about in the news. So we learned about this in an Associated Press article with the headline, Trump administration gives personal data of immigrant Medicaid enrollees to deportation officials. That was the news. And so we didn't hear about this ahead of time. They didn't give us any kind of notice this was going to happen. This was despite decades of practices where Medicaid would keep this information just for the purposes of administering the Medicaid program. So we sued about this too. Next slide. There's the caption. Bunch of states on this one. This one's being led by the state of California. They've been doing excellent work. And what's kind of interesting about this case is, next slide, please. After we sued, so not before, but after we sued, the Department of Homeland Security and CMS entered into a data sharing agreement that kind of papered over the fact that they didn't have any formal agreement ahead of time. This was effective July 9th, 2025. I believe we sued in this case, I think it was July 1. To go back and check, but I think that's what it was. And next slide. So what this does, what this data sharing agreement does, is it gives ICE employees direct logins to TMSIS. TMSIS being a big Medicaid database that other folks on this table will have more information about than me. But next slide. It includes all the things that you'd be afraid about including, right? Includes name, address, SSN, date of birth, sex, phone number, et cetera, et cetera. So those are the data elements that ICE has available to it. So we did get a preliminary injunction in this case too. And the highlights for this preliminary injunction are, so we moved on the basis that this was arbitrary and capricious government action. So an agency of the federal government can't do something arbitrarily and capriciously for no reason without considering the facts and circumstances, right? And that's exactly what the court here held, that it constituted arbitrary and capricious government action. Next slide. Now you might take a look at this order and it will express some skepticism. Because we also, in our complaint, we have contrary to law claims. We say you can't do this, it's against the law. Medicaid doesn't allow this confidential data to be shared for immigration enforcement purposes. There's some skepticism expressed in the order about this, but the court did not rule on that basis, in part because we did not move for preliminary injunction on that basis. We moved for preliminary injunction on the basis that it was arbitrary and capricious, and that was just so obvious, as in fact the court held. So next slide. So this is the bit of the order talking about some of the statutory authority, excuse me, and kind of expressing some skepticism about our contrary to law claims. But I do want to point out and highlight the next section that the court is not ruling on those contrary to law claims. There's a complicated statutory and regulatory landscape. No holding was made. So next slide. But there were significant holdings about why this was arbitrary and capricious. And I recognize I'm running short on time. We'll skip through those slides, but I commend it to you. The basic rationale is that, as we talked about, this was an executive action and agency action that happened in the news. They didn't even want to tell us about this. I believe it was a leaker within CMS. And so, we didn't have any notice about it. We had no ability to comment about it. We were never given an opportunity to direct the executive action that we wanted. And we weren't given any reasons, obviously, because they didn't want to tell us that this was even happening. So the court held that this was arbitrary and capricious. And the court's holding was essentially go back to the drawing board. The Department of Justice in this case has represented that they're not going to appeal this preliminary injunction. Instead, what they're going to do is they're going to re-implement this policy with an attempt at a reasoned decision-making process. And so what the court has allowed is for the United States needs to tell us when it's done that, and then the preliminary injunction is going to be in effect for 14 days after they give notice of their new decision-making process. So it'll give us an opportunity to bring our same contrary to law claims, our same claims about the process that needed to be followed. They're claiming that they don't need to do a rulemaking here. So notice and comment rulemaking requires the opportunity to submit comments and get rules back. We'll see exactly what they end up doing. So all of those same claims survive and can be brought again in the event that the policy is re-implemented. So the third case is Perwara. And next slide, please. Here we are. Yes, perfect. And big caveat, I'm not involved in this case. The other cases that I'm talking about, I have some involvement in. This one, I don't. We have a team at the Attorney General's office, the Washington State Attorney General's office, who's working on this, and they're doing fantastic work. And I just kind of read documents in the docket to put together this presentation for you today. So apologies for any lack of depth on my knowledge here. So the basic question in this case has to do with, and we can go to the next slide, the definition of federal public benefit in 8 U.S.C. 1611A. So folks in this room, I'm sure, are aware. So the Personal Responsibility and Work Opportunity Reconciliation Act of 1996 requires that federal public benefits be provided only to citizens and qualified immigrants. So then what is a federal public benefit such that those kinds of documentation requirements attach? Long been applied only to things you apply for, things like TANF and Medicaid and SNAP. Hasn't been applied to services that are provided without an application process, services that are provided on a walk-in basis, Head Start programs, educational programs that are not post-secondary, for example, hasn't been applied to those since its instantiation in 1996. But the new interpretation that came out this summer said, no, 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 it actually applies to all those things. Everybody before us has read the statute wrong. And so we're going to apply the PERORA requirements to basically any public funding for poor and needy people in the United States. That was the essential interpretation of the statutory requirement. So we tweet about this too. And we can go to the, yeah, perfect. So that's our caption showing all the states that are involved. And the highlight here is that we've got our preliminary injunction. It's still in place. And the highlight is we won on basically every basis that we argued. We argued that it was subject to notice and comment rulemaking because they just gave us notices, new interpretation notices of how they were going to do this statute and this implementation. The court held that's right, subject to notice and comment rulemaking. We argued that it was arbitrary and capricious, in large part because it ignored the large reliance interests that had been built up over time in administering these programs. And the court said, yeah, that's right too. You're ignoring the reliance interests. In fact, the court said you seem to be you spurned the reliance interests. I think was the language in the order. We also argued it was contrary to law. We said you could look at the statutes and you could do some basic statutory interpretation on these statutes, and you can tell that there's a good reason that since it was implemented in 1996, these particular kinds of benefits have all been excluded. Everybody who read this before now weren't idiots. They were correct. And the court said, yeah, that's right as well. The statutes all, in fact, do exclude the public benefits that had been excluded since the act was first enacted more than 20 years ago. And finally, the court even held it's unconstitutional because it violates the spending clause of the United States Constitution for much of the same reason that the gender ideology and denial of care orders were violating the Constitution, in that the president doesn't get to set funding conditions. Congress gets to set funding conditions. You can't surprise the states with new conditions long after they've taken the money. So I have some excerpts of the orders in those materials that kind of goes over all of that. And running short on time, I do want to cover the marketplace integrity rule just a little bit. Not yet. Not yet. The United States has 60 days, though. Yeah, they have special rules. Normally it's 30 days, but the United States gets 60. So the last case is the marketplace integrity rule. And again, short on time, I'm going to kind of skip to the end. We filed for a motion for a preliminary injunction that has not been ruled on. There's another case, I think District of DC, although Jane can correct me, Baltimore, so that must be Maryland, where the plaintiffs in that case were successful in getting a preliminary injunction against most of the bits of the rule, especially the bits that impact Washington State. The one exception is the bit that Jane was talking about, having to do with gender affirming care being an essential health benefit. That's the big thing that affects Washington that has not been preliminarily enjoined. All the other aspects of the marketplace integrity rule that affect our health benefits exchange have been preliminarily enjoined. So we're waiting for the ruling on that. And we hope that we will be victorious, but more to come.
Thank you so much to all of our panelists. We have time for one question.
The question that came in over the chat is, are there any states that have figured out a good idea to deal with all of this in 1 minute or less?
Well, I think it's worth acknowledging we live in a state that has an attorney general that's been very aggressive about defending the state and our statutes. We also live in a state where we have coverage programs that provide some modicum of backstop that are not afforded in other states, that we have a Cascade Care Savings Program, that we have a 1332 waiver and a place for people to go, that we have our state's Apple Health Expansion Program. We have taken a number of steps that are going to mitigate the effects. It's not going to feel like that, right? Because this is still immense, and I think a lot of people are going to lose coverage, and we're going to have to deal with that. But we would be in a much worse place if we weren't living in Washington, and so that's worth just acknowledging at this time.
Well, I want to say thank you so much to all our panelists, and thank you, Vanessa, who didn't even get a chance to moderate so too much because you had such great content. Thank you so much. So I'll say a little bit about what's going to happen next. We are going to have a 5-minute break. Okay. Welcome to the second part. Thank you. Welcome to the second part of this 3-part event, Mending Healthcare through Community. So what we're going to do is we have one more wonderful panel with us today, and then after that, we're going to shift into party mode. So you're welcome to stay around. There will be more snacks, and we'll have some discussion with NOLA as well. Our earlier panel was, of course, focused on legal strategies. Thank you so much for the panelists that were with us today. And then this next conversation brings us closer to community from groups and organizations and government entities that are connected to communities leading for change.
So this panel is going to be about lived experience, community power, and the resilience that comes from being empowered and finding the lived experience. So when people come together, what really matters the most is access to care, dignity, and justice. So we're going to get to hear from community members and panel government leaders who are not only responding to harm, but they're building something better in place not to harm. So we invite you to listen with real curiosity, reflect deeply, and consider how your work connects to theirs. And of course, we'll leave time for you to ask questions at the end. We'll do our best. And then if you're in the location, there are little leaves around on the round tables. As you're listening to the panel discussions and you have some ideas, jot down what you think we could do or you could do to improve healthcare in Washington state.
And with that, we're going to turn it to NOLA's amazing senior policy advocate, Lichi Liang, and who will introduce our great panel.
Can everybody hear me? Can everybody hear me? All right, the working microphone. We are honored to be joined today by 4 esteemed community leaders. To my left, or my right, your left, is Luzmila Fries, the Director of Community Programs at the Latino Community Fund, where she leads health and economic development programs focused on advancing equity in food systems, healthcare access, and economic opportunity. With over 10 years of experience in program leadership, advocacy, and community engagement, she's worked closely with community partners to drive sustainable systemic change to achieve health and economic justice for all. We're also joined by Vicki Lowe, the Executive Director of the American Indian Health Commission, a descendant of the Jamestown S'Klallam and Bella Coola First Nations. She leads statewide efforts to strengthen tribal and urban Indian health systems, including the development of the Tribal Assister Project and Indian Healthcare Reform Manual for Washington State, as well as helping draft legislation and getting passed the Washington Indian Health Improvement Act. Karina Patel, MPH, is a public affairs manager at the Tubman Center for Health and Freedom. She leads communications and policy, helping shape the organization from its founding to clinic launches and advocacy campaigns. Finally, Lika Smith is executive director of the Pacific Islander Health Board of Washington. She's the mother of 6, grandmother to 2, and a longtime social justice activist committed to serving the community, as well as being a graphic designer and website designer in her spare time. So to start us off, we'd like to invite each panelist to tell us about their organization and how it centers community health in their work, starting with Vicki.
Hi, Squatchy. Good afternoon. I'm Vicki Lowe, since Nasty Alum Newsglayam, since not Nuxluck. My name's Vicki Lowe, Executive Director of the American Indian Health Commission. The American Indian Health Commission is a tribal organization that was created by the federally recognized tribes in Washington State, very much connected to the Centennial Accord. And we provide a forum for our tribes to come together with the urban Indian health programs and the Indian healthcare providers in Washington State, and really try and, work together where we can to make sure that access to care barriers are addressed, that funding issues between the state and the tribes are addressed. There's a lot of legal reasons why that needs to happen. There's a whole set of federal Indian health laws connected with the Indian Self-Determination Act of 1975 and the Indian Healthcare Improvement Act of 1976. But also going back to, many Supreme Court cases, starting with the Marshall Trilogy, which included the Cherokee Nation v. Georgia, where the federal trust responsibility was built. And so our work with the state and the federal government are both part of a government-to-government relationship, I think, which is distinctly different. But because our people, our ancestors suffered from attempted genocide, from, our children being put in boarding schools and not learning how to be parts of family and community and being sent back to community if they were lucky enough to survive the boarding schools. So, we're working to address those behavioral health issues. I just spent the reason I'm not there in person, I spent the earlier part of my week at a tribal behavioral health crisis academy where we are supporting tribes planning how to address behavioral health crisis within their communities. So even though we have that government to government relationship, the impacts on our people and the work that we do is really focused on the impacts of discrimination, really. And I spent a lot of my time in Olympia working with the state agencies. We've been trying to, make new relationships with the new state government, and now we have all the impacts of the things happening at the federal level. As I was watching the presentations, I was thinking, there are some American Indian, Alaska Native exemptions because of that treaty trust responsibility, but we know that our people will continue to be impacted, even like the work requirements for Medicaid. Not all American Indian, Alaska Native families are just American Indian, Alaska Native. They're also mixed families. So we have really been looking at how we're going to prepare for educating and protecting the system of care that we've developed to try and address the health disparities of our people in Washington State. We have some of the highest, and our people are most highly impacted by the opioid crisis. During the last 5 years between COVID and the opioid and fentanyl crisis, our life expectancy decreased by 8 years. And so we know that not only are we fighting that, but now we have these new issues that we have to deal with as well. So I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Vicki. Karina, would you like to go next?
Yeah. Hi, everyone. My name is Karina Patel, and I'm from the Tubman Center for Health and Freedom. Tubman Health was founded because the current healthcare system wasn't designed for our communities. It wasn't built to keep Black, Indigenous, immigrant, and working class families healthy. It was built on exclusion and profit. And so the field often talks about access to healthcare, but at Tubman Health, we're equally concerned about the experience our communities have within the healthcare setting. And when we talk about centering community health, We mean starting over and building something entirely different. And that has been such an exciting and beautiful process to be part of over the past 5 years. At Tubman Health, community members are not just passive recipients of care, they're the designers, decision makers, and leaders in the healthcare setting. And that shows up in our research, which is led and owned by community in a time when data is being erased and even our identities are being erased. Tubman Health has launched our own Community Health Research Institute to protect our communities and make sure that our stories continue to shape policy and practice. Community also shows up in our physical spaces that center Black, Indigenous, and otherwise marginalized communities. We're building a network of physical healing spaces in our communities that are filled with gardens, light, and community art, but most importantly, safety, love, and whole person care. And of course, community also shows up in the care itself. We're currently delivering this new community design model of care at our 2 clinics through our collaborative care teams who are deeply rooted in the communities that they serve. This is like a collaborative care team who sees patients as whole people and not problems to be solved. And it's been just amazing to see this model come to life and to continue to grow. And really what ties together all of this is that, I really appreciate what Daphne was saying just to start this off, but for us, healthcare isn't just about medicine. Healthcare is also about power, belonging, and the freedom to live healthy, whole lives. And so, we view that as both the individual and collective responsibility. And we believe that we have the opportunity and the responsibility to make liberation real in our lifetimes. And that's kind of what our model is all about. And it's our compass guiding everything we do. So just grateful to be here alongside the other organizations being represented.
Thank you so much. Lika, I don't know if you're able to come off mute right now.
Yeah, I'm afraid to turn my camera on.
No worries. Would you like to tell us about how Pacific Islander Health Board centers community health in your work?
Yes, absolutely. Talofa, everyone. I am Lika Smith and the director of Samoan Descent at the PI Health Board. At the PI Health Board, we have many different island representations, some that people have never heard of, like Yap, right, and Palau. The PI Health Board focuses on community-led, culturally aligned strategies to address health disparities among our Native Hawaiian Pacific Islander community. Our work emphasizes building community trust. Trust is very important in our community. And once you break it, it's hard to regain it. And advocate for policies that address inequities in the system. For example, our original board members were instrumental in organizing the community to fight for the reinstating of COFA care. We center community health by grounding every program, policy push, campaign in the lived experiences of our communities. From maternal health navigation to statewide advocacy, our work is led by NHPI Voices. It is driven by cultural humility, so people could learn about humility and accountability, because health equity starts with honoring community truth. One of our key strategies is hiring within our communities. For example, our cultural and health enrollment navigators are respected community members with deep roots in one of our many Pacific Islander populations. These navigators help community members access resources and navigate dominant cultural systems, which is really hard to explain sometimes. Provide culturally grounded and in-language support. They serve as trusted sources for information, helping to rebuild trust that has been eroded by historical injustices and exploitative research practices. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Lika. Luzmila?
Can you hear me? Hello? Okay, artisan. Hi, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Luzmila Fries, and I'm the director at the Latino Community Fund. We are a statewide organization. Our mission is to build power within the Latino community by working specifically with documented, undocumented, and immigrant communities. We do this through our different programs, civic engagement, economic development, and health. What is our approach to health? Well, it's basically we start at the ground level. We work in areas where access to healthcare or emergency services are non-existent or very limited. And how do we do this? Well, first of all, we work with promotora. We use the promotora level model, sorry. So promotoras, just for those who doesn't know, is community workers. There are people who come from the community, who understand that community, because we understand that our understanding of the situation, what's happening on the ground is very, very limited, and they are the ones who have that knowledge. So we work with them directly. One of the things that we do is, for example, we provide CPR trainings. Within that program, we train people from the community, basically promotoras. We provide them with the equipment, we provide them with the training, all that is for free. And what we are doing is building that capacity at the ground level. So eventually they can work with other organizations, or if somebody has a need for CPR training, that's just an example, they can come to them directly. What we do as an organization, we pay for the CPR cards directly, because sometimes we have members of the community who cannot afford to buy for us, to pay it, I'm sorry, for that card, which is only like $23, $25. They cannot afford that, so we pay for that. Or sometimes when we are partnered with other organizations, they cannot even afford that, but they can pay, for the fee for the promotora. So that's how we partner with them. That's one example. We also address food insecurity, and that is by providing direct service, by providing vouchers to communities. Just recently, last week, we partnered with a small business that is located in an area which is kind of like a considered food desert. And the way what we are doing is we provided funds to that business so they can offer food to members of the community who couldn't afford to buy food. And the business wins, and also the community benefits from that directly. In addition to that, we advocate for structural change or structural improvement. Some of the work that we have done in this area, several years ago for the 1332 waiver, we worked with NOLA, and we created a landscape scan to basically understand what are the needs on the ground, and the information that we capture from that survey was utilized by HBE, Health Benefit Exchange, as they were developing their program. That is just one example. Another area on structural change that we are trying to work on through policy is equitable access to health, to clean and fluoridated water. That's another area. Basically, in sum, the way that we do is working directly, listening to what the community is saying, implementing what they are, the information that they are providing us with. Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you, Luzmila. So great work by all of our community-based organizations, and more challenging in our current moment. Given the myriad challenges that we are facing from the federal administration, I invite our panelists to tell us how your community is responding to federal challenges, and how allies can support you in that work. Vicki, do you want to start?
Sure. Thank you, Ichi. So our community, again, because of that government to government relationship, our tribal leaders have actually been going to DC and speaking to Congress, but also speaking in committee meetings and talking about the impacts of these cuts to our communities. And we're successful in getting some of those protections and exemptions for the work requirement and the 6-month redetermination for Medicaid. But even at that, we know the impacts will be huge. So in Washington State, we've been meeting and talking about what are the things that we can do. And, to be honest, I think Jane mentioned this funding challenges, having programs cut, stop and starts of funding. Those are things that we're used to in a long part of our history with the federal government. So this is not like unusual for us. I think the big thing about times like this is it is a good time to find partners that you maybe not would work with in any other time, and to be really innovative. We have the Tribal Assister Project, which is they're navigators, so part of the Washington Health Benefit Exchange, and have access to the Health Plan Finder, but they have extra ability to verify tribal enrollment. And one thing we think that could help is if we have those tribal assisters be able to do the income verifications like the healthcare authority workers, even though our people won't have to do the 6-month redeterminations unless they have a mixed family. We know that that's a way we could partner with the state and help make sure that people aren't losing their coverage because their documentation isn't being able to be verified in a timely manner. And so we're looking at also how can we expand the Indian healthcare delivery system for Medicaid. If a American Indian Alaska Native is seen in a tribal clinic, that service is paid at 100% of the federal match. So it actually is a savings to the state. So how can we expand care to more American Indians, Alaska Natives on Medicaid and leverage in more federal funds, which is, I think, the opposite of what they were trying to do here with all these cuts. So can we utilize telemedicine? Can we use there's a specific kind of care coordination agreement that we can use to bring a provider into the Indian healthcare delivery system. Can we use those things to expand care to American Indians, Alaska Natives that don't live on or near a reservation and don't have access to the Indian healthcare delivery system, to bring more funds into the system that way? So those are some of the things that we're looking at and really trying to be good partners, with the state and with our community members.
Thank you, Vicki. Karina, would you like to go next?
Yeah, sure. I think at Tubman Health, one of our first responsibilities is about protecting our communities. And so we've been really intentional about how we operate, how we fund our work, and how we safeguard access to care. The previous panel did a great job of highlighting the landscape. And we know that these aren't abstract issues. Our communities are feeling the impacts of that. But even in the face of these threats, I think one thing that we've carried throughout this year is just being uncompromising in our values. An example of that is on Harriet Tubman Day this year, we made a statement by publishing our guiding principles publicly for the first time, because being rooted in our values is more important now than ever. But even going back to when we were founded in the early days of the pandemic, we knew that we simply couldn't go back to business as usual. So we invested in that community design process that I was describing in the previous question, and just building out a model that is community owned, sustainable, and scalable. And so that foresight has really prepared us for this moment, because we're about providing that clinical care, but also addressing the systems that affect the environment in which the care is delivered. And so the trifecta of our research, clinical, and policy work is really key to our ability to move forward and be independent. So we're proudly an independent institution that's owned and led by the Black community and sustained through deep partnership across public and private sectors. We currently do not receive any direct funding from the federal government, but we know that we exist within the larger system, and that's why we feel responsibility in creating safety and liberation in real time. At our clinic, the Healing House, we've created a sanctuary. It's a space where we refuse to let the federal attacks touch. The Healing House is our clinic, like our micro center, while our larger clinic is being built. And it's a place where community members can have a consistent experience of safety and loving care. And then our research institute also embodies this, just another layer of protection because we're grounded in data sovereignty, even when signing contracts with funders. And it ensures that our community's stories, needs, and outcomes cannot be erased. And then to answer the last part of the question, when we think about how our allies can support, I think it's really about investing in the builders and the solutions that work. And I think this panel represents some of that work that's happening in our state that's led by the communities most affected by the landscape. And so we really need to invest in the community-owned institutions, the infrastructure, and the movements that are built to be resilient in the evolving political landscape. And it's just important to resource those community solutions because they do exist. Thank you.
Thanks, Karina. Lika, would you like to go next?
Sure. So our community is responding to the many federal challenges with fierce organizing and the TOA mindset. And the TOA means warrior mindset. So our board is all ready to fight. I don't know if you are aware of our partner island agencies. Everybody's on social media coming out, blasting education, questioning the federal government. But we draw on our cultural resilience and work on advocacy as always. And we are building and joining coalitions, and we utilize a rapid education campaign, not a rapid response, rapid education, through one-on-one conversations. And that's because we have to go to community leaders one-on-one, have respectful conversation with them to help them understand what's going on and to counter whatever federal news is coming out. So we have to educate and protect simultaneously. And it's a lot of work, but this is what we do for our community. One of our funders didn't think that educating our community was revolutionary enough, but it is revolutionary to educate and to have them understand the dominant culture. You know, it's hard to navigate the American culture. One of the battles that we've been deep in is the Medicaid discrimination that we witnessed personally. When some of our pregnant moms were dropped from obstetrics care at Valley Hospital simply because they were on Apple Health. And then other hospitals too. So we have a perinatal specialist who performs a service for hospitals by performing triage on our community members. And she'll call the hospital and say, hey, we have a client coming in. And because of the language barriers, she does this to protect our community. And so they don't get frustrated and leave the hospital. Because most of our community members feel discriminated against at hospitals. You know, they're always disrespected. There's such negative or small microaggressions that constantly happen. And so she'll call the hospital and say, hey, we have a patient coming in. The hospital asks about the insurance. And the minute they hear that it's Apple Health, they tell our perinatal specialist that they would not be mad if that client was sent somewhere else, even though that's the local emergency hospital that our client has to go to. So we've been battling Valley Hospital for clarity on all these policy changes, and we've gotten nowhere. We tried raising the issue with the state, but have not heard back from the HCA. Instead, an insurance rep informed us that our letter to the HCA had been forwarded to all insurance CEOs and told them to fix it. So no accountability, no follow-up, just a pass the buck moment. We had one meeting with DOH, and it seemed like they were leaning towards blaming our moms because they were many in our community are high risk pregnancies, but that doesn't diminish the fact that they're still being kicked out of care when they're 6 months pregnant, and it takes a month to get an appointment. 6, 7 months. You know, one mom was kicked out at 8 months. So and then her first appointment with the new provider was after her due date. So yeah, that's fun. And another issue that we always fight for is accessible language. I don't know how many times I have to talk about this, but translation is great, but plain language policies across agencies that are co-designed with those of us that are most impacted would be really helpful. When systems speak in codes and acronyms and legalese, they're not informing us. They're definitely excluding us. And during this unprecedented time, plain language is more important than ever. There was the prompt question said, how can allies support? And you all can support by resourcing NHPI-led organizations, amplifying our calls for equity, and showing up not in just moments of crisis, but in the long haul of system change. Health systems and allies do not tap into the power of our health board coalition, which is a combination of 14 ethnic health boards. That's a lot of power that you're not tapping into. So please, come listen deeply, fund boldly, and join us for create authentic relationships. Sorry.
Thank you, Lika. Luzmila?
Okay, so for us, one of the first things that we did was to connect with our funders and basically try to educate our funders in terms of our reporting. Because before this administration, there was a lot of information that it was required. And after this, there's certain information that it was required, but we don't think that is proper, not proper, but it will be not safe for the communities that we are working with. So we have very serious conversations with our funders, and thank God they understood and then help us to kind of like reshift a little bit the way how we are reporting. In addition to that, I will say another thing that we have been doing is strengthening our partnerships with other organizations to provide resources and to create awareness within the community. We also internally, we have been creating spaces for us to educate the community or inform the community about what is happening. And we are doing this because there is so much misinformation, and something that we have been learning over the years is that our community, I'm sorry if there's anybody here who is very pro, like Facebook and all that stuff, but that's where our community gets the information. So we are trying to kind of like demystify or change that and get them to see exactly what it is. We are even not telling them things from our perspective. We are just providing them with information that is useful for them. So that's one thing. And the last thing that I will add to that is, and I just feel like we are back to COVID again on this one, is creating spaces for the community to talk, for them to be heard. I'm sorry. And this one is a little tough because, in our community, we are very into in-person, sitting together, eating, right? And now sometimes it's really difficult for them. They feel like if you see, and I'm sorry, I'm going to be very direct here. Like if you see a couple of brown people standing in a corner, they feel afraid that suddenly they're going to be, somebody from ICE is going to show up. So we, for instance, in our office, we organize events where they can come in and we have tea and then we talk, or we engage in certain, activity, at the office. And this is something that makes them feel good, but also, okay, is there somebody who speaks Spanish? Desahogarse, what's the word? Unburden themselves, share with us. So those are the things that we, have been doing in addition to advocacy and, working on policy reform. But these are like the immediate activities that we are doing to support our community.
Thank you, Luzmila. So we invite questions from both our Zoom attendees and the room. But to kick us off, I've got a question for the panel. So we learned this month that Governor Ferguson's administration plans to destroy 30,000 abortion pills purchased by Jay Inslee's administration for over $1.2 million back in 2023 when the Supreme Court overturned Roe and constitutional protections for bodily autonomy. The current administration claims this is the plan because there is no demand for the abortion pills. Does this match the experience of your communities? Don't know. Vicky, do you want to, have you heard anything about reproductive health access from tribes?
I'm going to speak outside of my role as Executive Director for the American Indian Health Commission. I'm the chair of the Washington State Women's Commission, and we helped make sure that happened. So this is the first time hearing of it, and I'm not very happy. Within our communities, it is difficult because of, the federal funding and the Byrd Amendment. We have to be careful about the funds that we use to make sure they don't go for abortion. But there are a lot of, if you see a tribal casino, a tribal golf course, that's where we get the money to do the things that we can't do with our federal funds. So that's horrible.
Thanks, Vicki. Happy to share more information and think about advocacy outside of your role at AIHC. Karina?
Yeah, I would just say it's definitely been shocking to learn about that situation. I think there's always a need and would love to see more creative problem solving there. And I know that many groups in our state are mobilizing to find a solution and working closely with the governor's office. But there's, of course, always a need. And, there's opportunities to be more creative about how to distribute the supply.
Thank you. Lika?
I'm embarrassed to say I've not heard about this because I'm focusing on moms right now. But as the former Seattle Now president, I will tell you this is disheartening. And I can't see that our community would advocate for this.
Thank
Can
you,
I-
Lika. Lose me. Go ahead, Vicki.
Oh, sorry, no, go ahead first. I'll go after.
Well, I will say that I just heard this now, but I think that that's going to put a kind of like a strain in our community because first of all, that's a subject that is kind of like still taboo within our community, and now adding this is kind of like another layer. So yeah, it's going to be very difficult. I'm sorry. Yeah.
Vicki?
I'm just gonna say this is really classic, privilege. Saying they haven't heard that there's a need. I mean, what did they do to find out? Where's their data? Who did they ask? Where were they checking? Yeah, so that's not okay.
Those are great questions, and we have not received answers as to what the Ferguson administration currently plans to do. We understand that they are exploring options, but have not received an update in the last week, to my knowledge. I don't know if there are folks in the room that want to ask a question, or I don't actually have access to the Zoom Q&A. So an opportunity to ask a question of our panel. I see Emily approaching with her laptop.
We have a question from the chat from Kathy, who wants to know more about, can anyone go to the Tubman Center and more about that?
Yeah, Tubman Health is currently accepting patients at the Healing House, which is our micro center, but we definitely know that the need is greater than what our small clinic can provide. We provide primary care services to our community, but we are building our larger clinic, our Tubman Health Center at the Rainier Beach Light Rail Station in South Seattle, and we'll be breaking ground in Q3 next year. And when we open that clinic, we'll have capacity for 12,000 primary care patients.
That's fantastic. Thanks for sharing. I have a question for you, Vicki, about one of, I'll just say, I live in Whatcom County and have had the benefit of seeing the partnerships both at Lummi Nation and also at the Swinomish tribe. They've been really instrumental in leading behavioral health collaborations that extend not only to tribal members, but far beyond, both in behavioral health and in DHAT world. And so I was wondering if you would like to share a little bit about either of those projects and the broader access available.
Yeah, I think I was supposed to share about the Jamestown model, which that is based on. So as I said, I'm Jamestown, and we only have about 250 tribal members living in our community here. So when we went to open a clinic, they were like, "Ooh, we don't want to all see the same doctor. That's weird." But we ended up opening a larger clinic and being like the primary care provider in Squim here, and that's a model that kind of took off with some other tribes. In Anacortes, the Swinomish tribe opened up the Dijwale Clinic, which is an opioid treatment program. Lemmy has done that, and that's been happening across the state. And it really is based on, what we call community health, I think, but which is public health, is that you have to treat a whole community. You can't just take care of some members of the community. It's really a strong part of our belief system as Indigenous people too. But it's, Indian Health Services can't see non-beneficiaries, is what they call if you're IHS eligible, but tribal clinics, because of those laws I talked about, Indian self-determination and the Indian Healthcare Improvement Act, are able to see and bill third party for those. And not only does that help provide care within those communities, there is also federal law that says if we bill for third party for Medicare and Medicaid services, those funds have to be reinvested back into healthcare in the community. So it really is like the state has helped some of the tribes expand their buildings through capital funding, but that is actually a long-term investment into those communities, because not only are they seeing patients, but as funding comes through from Medicare and Medicaid, those funds are invested back into the healthcare delivery system, into the community. During COVID, it was a big deal. The tribes were able, because of the way that public health and healthcare are together, they were able to put 500,000 COVID shots in arms in Washington State in partnership with the local health jurisdictions and the Department of Health.
Thank you, Vicki. It's very helpful. I want to return to the issue that Lika raised around Valley Medical. I think most of us are generally aware that when someone has Apple Health, it can be hard to find providers that take Apple Health. But given the specific challenge of getting obstetric services at Valley, we've also heard that some other hospitals are less than excited about providing prenatal care to Apple Health recipients. Does anyone else on the panel have any sort of anecdotal or data speaking to the challenges of accessing either obstetric care or more general care as an Apple Health an Apple Health recipient in your community?
Sure. So we do not are service providers, just to let you know. But in our interactions with the community, they have mentioned, they have told us about several examples in which some of the issues that they have encountered whenever trying to get access to healthcare. Some of the issues that they have mentioned is, for instance, how do I put this? Whenever they call to a clinic to set up an appointment, they put it on hold. They have to wait for a long time. I mean, we are not talking about 5 or 10 minutes. We're talking about like maybe half an hour or an hour. There has been, then there's the issue when somebody finally gets to talk to them because they have an accent, they receive certain kind of discrimination. They are treated poorly. That's just over the phone. When they go to the actual clinic, the same situation occurs. There have been, I remember very clearly a case of somebody who actually went to a clinic and they received the person, put them in a waiting room, and the person was left there for hours. And then after a while, the person who is doing the cleaning shows up, opens the door, and finds her sitting there, and they are like, the clinic is closed. And yeah, and I heard twice that situation. In terms of the doctors, I have to say the service that they receive from the doctors has been good, but a lot of the problems are from the people who work at the reception area. In one occasion, actually, there were a couple of examples also that we got in terms of the patient is telling them, I'm having these symptoms, this is what is happening, and the doctor is actually being dismissive about it. And basically the answer is, well, just take some rest, take some Advil or, Tylenol or whatever, and then it will pass. We have a couple of those examples as well. I will stop here. I have more, but I will stop here for the other panel to add.
Vicky, go ahead.
Yeah, in the Portland area of IHS, which is where we are, there are no IHS-run hospitals, so our people do have to go to non-tribal facilities for any hospital care, and because reservations are in very rural, not easy to get to places, that has put access for OBGYN care very limited. I know we've worked to help support the implementation of doulas, and I think that's, and we have a maternal infant health work group that meets quarterly to talk about issues, but the DOH maternal mortality report did show not only horrible statistics, like 80% of all maternal mortality deaths were preventable, and many are caused by the system of care. And then our numbers are specifically higher. They started counting suicide and opioid and fentanyl overdoses too, and that raised the numbers. So, addressing not just access to like OBGYN, but also to behavioral health services before and after the birth is really important as well. And so we're working on expanding the behavioral health. Like I said, I was just at an academy where we're trying to help support tribes really developing their behavioral health systems, but the access to maternity care is just something we're seeing across the board. I know we were trying to work with the Astria Hospital in Yakima to see if if the tribes could like rent part of the facility and then bring in again that 100% FMAP payment and some what the IHS encounter rate for inpatient care through Medicaid, I think, is $3,200 a day. So bigger payments. And in the end, that's the issue with Medicaid, is that the providers don't get paid enough to provide the service. And so, these people who are already suffering because of low incomes also can't get good care, and it just like spirals into the health disparities that we see. So all these caused by the system and the lack of funding to really provide care that is equitable.
Question from the audience.
Hi, Vicki. I'm curious with the doulas, are you using them also for postpartum? So are they doing behavioral health assessments postpartum? And if they are, what's the experience with then connecting that mother with behavioral health services?
It's different at every tribe. More on the east side, I think there's a focus on the doulas because that's where the access problems are the worst. There's also, we have community health representatives and community health nurses that actually go to people's houses and can help them if, they trust them. And that's, I think, because those are trusted members of the community, they can help connect them to services too. And again, why we're helping the tribes expand their behavioral health services as well.
Thank you, Vicki.
Mhm.
And we have another audience member question.
Hi, thank you for everything y'all have shared today. My question is about kind of the current moment, and y'all spoke a little bit about different ways, in my mind, to be proactive. I think given the terrible headlines each day that we're all experiencing and the acute harms of our communities that they're experiencing, I'm curious, what are ways that you and your communities are being proactive rather than getting stuck in that posture of just being reactive to what's happening? And how would you like institutions, state institutions, and other partners to be proactive with you and your community?
Go ahead, Vicki.
I'm sorry, I feel like I'm talking a lot. I think it's really important to hear us. I mean, we have great ideas. We are on the, forefront of doing the work where there has probably never been enough money to provide the kind of care that people need. So I think really active listening. I feel like whenever I make suggestions, people think I have a lot of crazy ideas, but crazy enough to work, I tell you. If we can get the healthcare authority to let our tribal sisters do the income verification for American Indians, Alaska Natives, that will give them more staff, basically, but if they get too hung up on, oh, we can't because you're not an employee, instead of getting outside of their box and really thinking about how can I make this work, not why should this not work. That would be my suggestion.
Thank you. Karina, did you want to say something?
Yeah, I would say for us at Tubman Health, we're currently in our capital campaign to build that third clinic that I was talking about. And so really it's about building the infrastructure and having, state and local partnerships in that infrastructure. And that's kind of where we're at with just being able to scale the model. And then we're also doing, a clinical trial on our model of care to be able to document that and share that across the region and broader as well.
Lika, would you like to weigh in?
I think, gosh, yeah, Vicky said it all, I think. Fundus, right? Like we've been trying to get providers, pay for our own providers that see our own community. So that's where we were. We were also in coalition with the Doula for All group that helped change certification for doulas, and that is helpful for us as well. We did work with the HCA for COFA education, and instead of allowing us to do it our way, we had to follow their script, and it was the most boring presentation. Sorry, HCA. It was the most boring presentation ever, and our community, it did not resonate with our people. And so if you want us to do the job, then let us do it our way, because we're the ones who know our own communities.
Thank you, Lika. Final thoughts, Luzmila?
I think that Vicky and Lika said it correctly. It's just hear us because we are representing the community. We know what is happening on the ground. If there's anybody here from the Department of Health, I'm so sorry, but I'm going to be very honest. My work with them in the past was horrible. It's like a talking to a wall. We were giving them the ideas, which were efficient in terms of money and time, and they just ignore us. If you want to learn about how to work with community, look into, and this is outside health, this is working with economic development. look into the city of Seattle. That is my golden marker, because particularly the Office of Labor Standards, the Office of Sustainability and Environment, they do know how to listen to the community and work and mold things. They are very flexible in how to develop solutions and implement them. So those will be my suggestions.
Thank you. And thank you to all of our panelists. We really appreciate you taking the time to share your insights. We wish you were here to toast your work. But at this point, I think I'm going to hand things off to Daphne.
Thank you all for coming. We're so grateful that you all joined us and spent time with us this afternoon. For those of you who are online, thank you so very much. We are so grateful for your guys' attendance and spending time with us this afternoon. Can we get one more round of applause for our amazing panelists today? Thank you all so very much. Thank you. Thank you. If you guys learn from this content and you really, well, first, let me talk to the attorneys. Make sure that we have your bar number so you can get credit for this. And then if you wouldn't mind, if you really enjoyed this presentation and our panels, please consider donating to NOLA. Barcodes are on the tables. So what we're going to do is we're going to have a quick little intermission. Please don't leave. We're going to actually start partying and food and drinks. So if you guys wouldn't mind going out and getting some refreshments and getting ready so we can switch the room up again a little bit and get started for a party. Thank you guys so much for staying with us.